Genesis 9 begins by echoing the end of Genesis 1 and parts of Genesis 2, renewing the covenant between God and all creatures of the earth. New requirements are initiated that are meant to address the violence that brought about the flood. A common belief is this is the first time humans are allowed to eat meat, and this is the first time rainbows appear. But such ideas are not in the Hebrew text. Then, Genesis 9 ends by echoing the fall of Genesis 3. History is thus repeating itself. As we noted in the last video, Genesis 8 echoes Genesis 1 and renews creation in a similar structure that is found in Genesis 1. Genesis 9 continues this theme by now focusing in on the covenant with mankind and the earth, found at the end of Genesis 1 and through Genesis 2. But the commands expressed to Noah and his family are not identical to what we see in Genesis 1, thus giving the impression to many this is a new covenant with new freedoms, like being allowed to eat meat for the first time. But this interpretation is unlikely. First, the use of animals appears in passages that precede Genesis 9. In Genesis 4, Abel brought to God fat portions from his flock. Are we to think Abel just let the meat rot out in the field? Why even bring the fat portions, unless it was left over from slaughtering an animal for its meat? In Genesis 3, God made garments of animal skin for Adam and Eve. If they could kill and use animals for clothing, why not for meat? And finally, as we noted in our second video on Genesis 1, verse 28 says mankind can have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. The word for dominion is much harsher in Hebrew than it is in English and refers to ruling over someone in an oppressive manner. Joshua John Van E says, "They focus on gaining and exerting authority over another, a call to conquest and dominion. In them, humans are granted permission to use animals for their purposes." So in Genesis 1, animals were given to humans for their full purpose, implicitly suggesting we already had the right to hunt and kill the wild fish, wild birds, and all wild animals. Genesis 3:21 and 4:4 also support this understanding. So why does Genesis 9:3 seem to teach this is the first time humans were allowed to eat meat? Well, in the English it reads, "Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything." However, Van E notes in the Hebrew, there are no temporal indicators, so the English translations that imply plants were given in the past and now presently they can eat meat is based on inferences by translators. As Van E says, there is nothing in the context to indicate plants were given as food earlier than animals, since the right to eat meat can be implied from 128. Therefore, there is no textual reason to assume a temporal element in the comparison with plants. So if humans already had the right to eat meat, why does Genesis 9 even mention this? Basically, Van E found that Genesis 9 is following a classical Hebraic formula for introducing prohibitive legislation. Parallels can be seen in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, where the passages begin with a review of things already permitted to eat and then introduces prohibitions concerning them. As you can see, Deuteronomy 14:9-10 restates what is already in Leviticus 11:9-10, and begins by stating what is already permissible, to then state the prohibitions concerning what is in the domain of the seas and the rivers. Likewise, Genesis 9 follows a basic Hebraic structure, which begins by confirming humans have the right to eat meat and plants, to set up the immediately following new prohibitions concerning blood and violence. So instead of the text implying humans didn't have any previous right to eat meat, it actually confirms that eating meat was previously permitted, as we see implicitly taught in prior passages. Even early commentators like Philo of Alexandria argue Genesis 9 is a restoration of the domain given to humans in Genesis 1 that was temporarily suspended due to the flood, not a change in terms of the relationship between humans and animals. The mention that fear and dread of humans shall be upon every animal is meant to give the same connotation of what we see in Genesis 1:28, not new effects. Basically, it denotes rulership of mankind over the animal kingdom. For example, Isaiah 8:13 says to let God be your fear and your dread, teaching that God should be allowed to be their true ruler. Deuteronomy 11:25 says the fear and dread shall be upon the land that Israel treads on, which they were about to rule over on loan from God. Essentially, the Hebrew terms for fear and dread are portrayed in a more positive light, denoting rulership. In Genesis 9, God is simply restating that humans rule over the animals, as stated in Genesis 1. The only difference is, in Genesis 1, the command is given to humans, whereas in Genesis 9, it is stating the effect that such a command has on the animals. So they're essentially saying the same things, just from the human perspective in Genesis 1, and the animal perspective in Genesis 9. Some take issue with the Hebrew word verse 3 uses to designate every moving thing, which is to be food. The word is never used to mean all animals that exist, and refers more to things that creep on the earth, as a separate category from beasts, birds, cattle, or fish, and can be used to refer to swarming insects. However, the context of Genesis 9 seems to suggest it refers to a type of animal, broadly speaking, and not just insects or small creatures. John Walton suggests the reason for this is because it might be an Akkadian cognate that typically refers to wild beasts that travel in herds, distinct from domesticated animals, or wild animals that hunt or scavenge. Given that the flood account could have come from an Akkadian source, because the flood was supposed to happen in an Akkadian-speaking region, as well as the fact that other Akkadian cognates are found elsewhere, this understanding seems likely. Thus, God is reminding humanity they have permission to be predatory hunters over the most obvious types of animals that can function as food. However, it would be arguing from silence to suggest humans were only limited to wild herd animals and not domesticated animals or any other type of wild animal. Now, following this, as we mentioned, are the prohibitions or dietary restrictions. Some suggest this passage is restricting the consumption of blood, so no blood sausage for Noah. In reality, the prohibitions are probably more connected to the violence that brought about the flood, and due to how much humanity degraded itself in sin. God is setting up additional restrictions, since humanity cannot be trusted to act appropriately with animals or with each other. For instance, some commentators have suggested this refers to not eating meat that has not been processed or cooked. That is, it would still be raw and bloody. However, Benno Jacob and Claus Westermann argued the prohibition is against eating flesh with blood still pulsating in it. This is speculating, but perhaps prior to the flood, humanity partook in detestable rituals where animals were torn apart and eaten while they were still alive, and God doesn't want this to ever happen again. So humans are not to act as carnivorous animals and cannot eat something while it is still alive. Either way, the passage is more focused on separating humanity as a special class that is not permitted to eat things while they are still alive, or meat that has not been processed. God also issues a command regarding violence. Now, in order to prevent more bloodshed, God issues the command that murder requires a death sentence. If you remember back in Genesis 4, God attempts to delay the inevitable degradation of humanity after Cain murders his brother Abel by not sentencing him to death and trying to stop others avenging Abel with more violence. However, at this point, it seems humanity has degraded to the point where it can no longer be trusted not to increase violence throughout the land. So anyone who murders should be given the death sentence as a form of capital punishment to limit the amount of bloodshed one murderer can do. It is important to note a theme throughout Genesis that we have hinted to, which can be called the degradation theory. Humanity under Adam fell, then under Cain fell even more, and then under the sons of God fell even more. The flood was a reboot to stop humanity from spiraling even more out of control. But humans still continue to move further away from God and increase in sin even after the flood. This explains why God issues different commands at different times to respond to how humanity has degraded. The Abrahamic, Mosaic, and the prophesied New Covenant under the Messiah are restoration steps to pull humanity out of its degraded state and progress back to the state God had with Adam in Eden prior to the fall. Which is why parts of the Mosaic covenant were given because hearts were hard. The covenant under Noah is re-establishing the covenant with mankind in Genesis 1, but additional restrictions are set up due to how far humanity has degraded at this point. Thus, Genesis 9:1-7 is a restating of the covenant established in Genesis 1, with additional restrictions, which is why we see a restatement to be fruitful and multiply, that man is the image of God, and that they have dominion over the animals. What follows next is meant to echo certain parts of Genesis 2. Instead of God establishing Adam, God now establishes Noah. Instead of Adam being in the garden with animals, it is Noah and the animals brought off the ark. Noah also becomes a man of the soil, and like Adam, plants a vineyard, which grows fruit, similar to the fruit of the garden. Walton has argued Genesis 2 was meant to be a sequel to Genesis 1, in the same way Genesis 9 is a sequel to Genesis 8. Genesis 2 is the fulfillment of the ordering in Genesis 1. Now that the cosmos has been ordered and specified as God's temple, blessings flow from that for human culture, which plays out in Genesis 2, with man being given a new purpose, a priestly role, a role in naming the animals, and marriage is established. The covenant in Genesis 9 is meant to establish the functionality of the blessings in the same way. Humanity can now thrive and experience the blessings of an ordered cosmos, recovered from the chaos of the flood. As Meredith Kline says, the common grace covenant of Genesis 8:20 to 9:17 was designed to provide the historical order and set the world stage for the renewed program of redemptive covenant, particularly as that was to receive distinctive formulation in the Lord's covenant with Abraham. As we noted in a previous video of this series, the flood account uses hyperbolic language to describe the extent of the flood, so verse 11 is consistent with this idea. The designation of the rainbow is something unique to the biblical flood account that is not found in any other ancient Near Eastern version, and is the sign of the covenant. But it does not mean this is the first rainbow ever. Just like circumcision was established as a sign of the Abrahamic covenant, that doesn't mean it is the first time circumcision was ever performed. Covenants come with a sign meant to be an outward expression of that covenant. For example, the sign of the Mosaic covenant was keeping the Sabbath. God simply designated the rainbow in saying that from now on, this will be a reminder of what happened and that it will never be necessary again. What is interesting is the word for rainbow is the same word used for a war bow. Kenneth Mathews says, ancient mythology frequently has such imagery where a deity employs the bow and arrows of the skies. The Lord in Hebrew tradition is depicted as a divine warrior who subjugates his foes. But in Genesis 9, the rainbow represents God hanging up his warbow against mankind. Justice has been dealt, and now peace will ensue, as Meredith Kline says. The warbow is mentioned in God's arsenal of wrath, particularly when he is viewed as advancing in the judgment storm, dispatching his arrows of lightning. However, in the sign of the rainbow, the bow is not raised vertically and drawn taut in the face of the foe, but is suspended in the relaxed horizontal position. Accordingly, the designation of the rainbow as a battle bow may best be interpreted as suggesting the picture of the divine warrior with his weapons laid aside, turning from the path of judgment against rebellious mankind, prepared now to govern them with forbearance for a season. Now the bow has been hung in the sky, and the Lord will have no need to wipe out an entire generation in the land again. However, despite this, sin has not been dealt with. What follows is a repeat of the fall. The new man God appointed falls into sin, and his family follows him in his downfall. Noah begins by becoming a man of the ground. This is the only time in Scripture the phrase is used for someone becoming a farmer, which means it is probably done on purpose to show Noah is the new Adam. Noah is then immediately in a garden, specifically a vineyard he planted. And like Adam, he is corrupted by the fruit of the garden. Anthony J. Tomasino notes several parallels between Adam's fall and Noah's fall. Both are corrupted by fruit that was meant to bless them. See our video on Genesis 3 for more on that. Both are shamefully naked, and the fruit affects their sense of themselves. Ham plays a similar role as the serpent in this episode, being represented as the seed of the serpent here, and like Cain as well, who also fell. Ham tempts with forbidden knowledge, and in a curse issued by Noah, his offspring is doomed to be subject to the seed of the woman. Finally, Noah and Adam's nakedness is eventually covered. But there are some important differences that support the degradation theory. Tomasino says, when Noah partook of his wine, he lost his senses. He did not hide his nakedness among the trees. He uncovered his nakedness within his tent. He was not even aware when Ham saw his nudity. In a curious reversal of the fall, the forbidden fruit did not give him knowledge of his nakedness, but robbed him of it. Noah partakes of sinful fruit without even being tempted, loses sense, and does not even try to hide his nakedness, demonstrating that even though the flood wiped away an entire corrupt generation, sin was not fully dealt with, and still continues to plague the line of Adam. Noah is nowhere near where Adam was when he fell, thus setting up a grim future for humanity. What follows is one of the strangest passages in the whole Hebrew Bible. Robert Alto rightly notes, no one has fully solved what Genesis 9:22-27 is claiming, and a wide range of theories persist. The important thing to remember is this happens as a result and after Noah falls, so it's unlikely that God approves of the curse placed on Canaan. What Noah does is something as a result of his fallen state, and God plays no part in his actions. Therefore, it is a result of a fallen world, not of a just God. Perhaps the simple reading is all we need to posit, as Victor Hamilton proposed. Ham saw his father's nakedness, which was a cultural taboo, and so his offspring was cursed. This would explain why Shem and Japheth cover their father's nakedness with a garment, which does not appear to be any kind of euphemism. Hamilton simply argues Ham left the tent and failed to cover his father, so his sin was his lack of respect for his father, and then he went to boast about it to his brothers. This is possible, but it just seems to be too meaningless for the authors to even mention, or to be the cause of Noah's anger and curse. Now, an extreme idea is that the authors are using the idiom of seeing his father's nakedness as a way to say that Ham either raped or castrated his father. Mathews notes Noah may have been prevented from having a forced son, so he cursed the forced son of Ham. But this might be arguing from silence. Plus, this phrase is never an idiom to mean castration. But once again, due to limited data, it's still a possibility. Ultimately, I think Michael Heiser and John Walton present the most likely interpretation, but this is still speculation. Walton notes given the correlations to Genesis 3, there might be a female in the picture, namely Noah's wife, who is just assumed to be there with Noah. Given the text comes from a high-context culture, one doesn't need to explicitly state Noah's wife was present. It would just be assumed given her role. Next, Leviticus 20:11 explicitly states that a sexual relationship with one's mother can be described as nakedness of your father. So it is possible that Noah's wife was with Noah and also became drunk and passed out. lying exposed in the tent with Noah. Then Ham came in and was tempted by either his mother or his stepmother and impregnated her with his seed, which could have been how Canaan came about. There could also be a correlation in Genesis 19 after another catastrophic event, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot's daughters believe they are left alone in the world and will not be able to be fruitful and multiply. So they take advantage of their father's drunkenness so they can have their own children. Likewise, it is possible Ham, wishing to take advantage of the blessing to be fruitful and multiply, saw his mother, or hopefully his stepmother, and raped her unconscious body. He then went and gloated to his brothers, and then they entered into the tent backwards, so they would not be tempted, and covered both Noah and his wife. This seems to fit best with the subtleties of the text, and the following curse. But as we have noted, it is impossible to reconstruct what the author is trying to tell us with total confidence. But at least we can say that after the fall of Noah, it then opened up for the second fall of the family. Just like Adam's sin opened the door for Cain to sin. And just like Adam, the sin of the son was far worse than the sin of the father. Noah's response is rather odd, because he curses Canaan, and not Ham directly. Once again, this doesn't directly come from God in the text, and the curse is uttered in a fallen state, so it only compounds the effects of the second fall. The authors seem to want us to see that sin creates a rippling effect, and does not just stop with each of us. Even with that, Conrad Lauru reminds us in the ancient world, a word of blessing or curse, once uttered, can never be retracted. Thus, the curse uttered by Noah was thought to have real effects, even though it did not come from God, and seems to be the opposite of his plan. It is also possible the original curse applied to Ham and all of his descendants, but the Hebraic authors instead focused on the pertinent aspect, namely the ensuing conflict with the Canaanites, as Israel would have likely seen their conquest as the fulfillment of this curse. But with that, Meredith Kline reminds us, in no case is a destiny decreed that applies to all the descendants of that party. Not all Canaanites are reprobate. Not all Semites and Japhethites enter the kingdom. In each case, however, there was to be in some branch of the genealogical line in question a particular, notable experience of the predicated curse or blessing. The conquered Canaanites are to be seen as representatives of the serpent's seed, crushed under the heel of the redeemed people of the Lord in a typological act of judgment, pointing to the final judgment. In other words, the Canaanites in question have become the seed of the serpent by their own sin, as Cain did by his own sin, and as Ham did by his own sin. Israel carried out the fulfillment of this curse, while fulfilling the proclamation of Noah in a way that can make it fit with the plan of God. It affects the sinful Canaanites, who fell into detestable practices. It is unlikely to imply racism, as the very same context implies all people groups are related and have the same father. Israel was also warned they would be rejected and cursed if they fell into the same practices. So although the curse was not of God, it was still used by God, relating to another theme found elsewhere in Genesis. What man meant for evil, God used for good. Genesis 9 began on a high note, but ends at a very low point. Mankind was saved and reestablished a working relationship with God. But things couldn't even get started before sin spread through the family of Noah, and thus setting up the second fall of the civilization. Sin is portrayed as having a rippling effect, and it is set up to corrupt the whole world as the family of Noah spreads out, which is recorded in Genesis 10.